A glass of red wine came flying straight into my wife's face. It happened right there in the middle of the wedding hall, under soft lights and polite music. 1 second the room was buzzing with conversation, and the next, everything went dead quiet. I stood frozen in my worn gray suit, watching my wife, Linda, tremble as dark red liquid slid down her cheek and soaked into her collar. Across the room, my daughter-in-law's wedding dress had a small tear near the bottom. Just a thin rip in expensive fabric. But that wasn't what made my blood turn cold. It was my son's voice behind me. Sharp. Controlled. Empty. "Mom," he said, loud enough for people nearby to hear. "Kneel down and apologize. Don't ruin my day." That was the exact moment I understood something I should have realized much earlier. This wedding was never meant to unite our family. It wasn't a celebration. It was a breaking point. And from that second on, everything began to fall apart. If you're listening to this story right now, wherever you are, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment saying where you're listening from. Maybe you're driving. Maybe you're lying awake after a long day. I read every message. And I believe this, behind every listener, there's a story they've never told out loud. Now let me tell you what really happened after that glass of red wine. I still remember the smell hanging in the air. Sweet and sharp at the same time. People slowly turned their heads away, pretending they hadn't seen anything. Pretending it wasn't their problem. Linda stood in front of me, her hands shaking slightly. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't even move. It was like her body had shut down just to keep her upright. I recognized that feeling immediately. It's the look of someone who realizes they've just been pushed out of their own family. The tear in Rachel's wedding dress was small, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Linda had stumbled while trying to avoid a chair that had been shoved into the aisle. No one fell. No glass shattered. No scream followed. Just an awkward moment that could have ended with a quiet apology and nothing more. But Rachel had been waiting for this. I saw it in her eyes the second it happened. That sudden shift, like a door opening. She raised her voice, grabbed a nearby glass of wine, and did something I never imagined I'd witness at a wedding. I stepped forward instinctively. Not as a guest. As a husband. But I stopped when my son, Mark, turned toward me. The look on his face wasn't the one I'd known for 30 years. It wasn't anger or confusion. It was calculation. His eyes swept the room, business associates, co-workers, people he hoped would matter to his future. Then he looked back at his mother. "Mom, just apologize," he said, calm and firm. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." Those words hit harder than the wine. I heard whispers behind me. Not one person stepped forward. No one asked if Linda was okay. In that room, we weren't parents. We were inconveniences. Rachel moved closer, pointing at the carpet where drops of wine stained the fabric. She talked about money. About image. About how that dress couldn't be replaced. I don't remember every word she used. I only remember how small I felt standing there, like something old that had finally outlived its usefulness. Mark tossed his mother a napkin. Not gently. Just enough for everyone to see. Then he said something he'll never forget. That she should step outside because she was embarrassing him. Linda lowered her head. Not to apologize, but because she was exhausted. I knew exactly what was running through her mind. That maybe she really was at fault. That maybe if she had moved slower, spoken less, existed quieter, none of this would have happened. That woman had survived illness. She had learned to walk carefully just so she wouldn't inconvenience anyone. And now, at her own son's wedding, she was trying to disappear. I placed my hand gently on her back. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I turned her toward the exit. In that moment, I chose not to fight. Not because I was weak, but because I understood something clearly. People who humiliate you in public don't respond to emotion. They only understand consequences. We left through a narrow side door. Behind us, the music grew louder, as if nothing had happened at all. That hurt more than the wine. I helped Linda into the car. She asked me quietly if she had ruined everything. I didn't answer right away. I started the engine instead. My hands were steady. Sometimes silence is the only thing holding what's left together. As we drove away from the estate, I looked back once. The lights were still bright. Everything looked perfect from the outside. That's when I felt something inside me close. Not love for my son, but innocence. And from that moment on, I knew this story was far from over. The ride away from the wedding felt longer than it should have. The road stretched ahead of us, smooth and quiet, while the glow from the estate disappeared in the rearview mirror. Linda sat beside me, her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window without really seeing anything. The wine had been wiped away, but the moment itself still clung to the air inside the car. After a few minutes, she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost embarrassed. "Do you think maybe I really did something wrong?" That question cut deeper than anything said back in the hall. I kept my eyes on the road. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I didn't trust my voice yet. Some truths need a moment before they're spoken. "No," I finally said. "You didn't." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't fully believe it. Years of learning to blame herself had made doubt feel natural. We drove in silence for a long stretch. Streetlights passed one by one, like quiet witnesses. I wasn't angry the way people expect in moments like that. I didn't want to shout or storm back inside. What I felt instead was a door closing inside me. Not the door of love for my son, but the door of excuse. Back at home, Linda went straight to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. Her shoulders sagged, like she'd been holding herself upright all evening and could finally let go. I helped her out of her coat and poured her a glass of water. "I'm tired," she said. "Not just tonight. I mean tired." I understood exactly what she meant. That night, she fell asleep quickly. I stayed awake. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been for a long time. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, letting pieces from the past few months line up on their own. The rushed wedding plans. The documents Mark kept bringing by, always with a reason ready. The way Rachel spoke about the future, about lifestyle, about what made sense. At the time, I thought it was ambition. Now, it felt like preparation. 6 months earlier, Mark had come over with a folder under his arm. He said Linda needed long-term care insurance, just in case her health ever took a turn again. He spoke carefully, like a concerned son. Rachel sat beside him, quiet, her hand resting gently over Linda's. Linda trusted them immediately. She always trusted her son. I read the papers that night, but I read them like a father, not like someone trained to look for traps. The text was clean. Professional. Nothing that would alarm an ordinary person. So I signed. Not because I was careless. Because I believed that inside our own family, no one would lay a snare. That belief didn't survive the wedding. After Linda fell asleep, I opened the old filing cabinet in the study. I pulled out copies of those documents and laid them across the desk. This time, I read slowly. Line by line. Word by word. The meaning had shifted. What had once looked like insurance now read like authorization. Control. Access to assets placed gently into someone else's hands. I didn't feel panic. I felt clarity. People don't usually break valuable things with force. They do it with paperwork. The next afternoon, I returned to the estate under the excuse of delivering a forgotten gift. The celebration was long over. No music. No guests. Just an empty house echoing with what had been left unsaid. I passed by the bridal suite. The door was unlocked. Inside, a folder sat on the table, untouched. I hadn't planned to look, but experience has a way of guiding your hands. I opened it. Budgets. Timelines. Notes written neatly in the margins. One line was underlined. Long-term care for Linda cost-saving option. Beneath it was the name of a facility I recognized immediately. Not a place for healing. A place people are sent when they no longer have a voice. I closed the folder. That glass of wine hadn't been a sudden outburst. It was part of a process. The fastest way to push someone aside is to make them look unstable. I sat in my car for a long time before driving home. I thought about Mark. About how much he knew. And the truth landed harder than anything else. He knew everything. Not out of cruelty, but fear. Fear of losing the position he'd just secured. Fear of disappointing the people he believed controlled his future. Some people betray out of hate. Others out of ambition. But the most dangerous ones betray because they believe they have no choice. When I got home, Linda was awake. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was. And for the first time, it was true. Because from that moment on, I stopped seeing Mark and Rachel as family members who needed guidance. I saw them as a situation that required patience. And I knew this much for certain. To uncover the truth, you have to let people believe they're safe. After the wedding, days passed without a single call from Mark. No apology. No explanation. Nothing. Rachel, on the other hand, filled social media with honeymoon photos. Perfect lighting. Elegant meals. Smiling faces framed like magazine covers. Linda looked at the pictures once, then turned off her phone without a word. I didn't stop her. Instead, I started paying attention. I grew quieter around them. Kinder, even. I let them believe we'd accepted being pushed aside. People often mistake silence for surrender. I didn't correct that assumption. Each morning, I walked Linda around the neighborhood at a slow, steady pace so she could regain strength. We talked about small things, the weather, the neighbors, the sound of birds in the early hours. In the afternoons, while she rested, I opened old files and backed up records. I didn't use my regular computer. I used an older one that wasn't connected to anything important. No accounts. No personal data. I wasn't rushing. I learned long ago that haste usually means emotion, and emotion clouds judgment. Mark had tried to be careful. But young people erase things the way they think is clever. They don't realize that what remains after deletion is often more revealing than what's left behind. I started with small inconsistencies. Harmless-looking expenses. Minor transfers. Amounts too small to trigger alarms on their own. But they appeared regularly, like a rhythm. That rhythm led me to a charity fund Mark oversaw. On paper, it supported legal outreach programs. Modest. Low profile. Respectable. The transfers were split carefully. Spread out evenly. Not enough to raise suspicion, but consistent enough to form a pattern. And patterns always lead somewhere. That money flowed into an intermediary account under the name of a newly registered media company. Rachel's company. I didn't jump to conclusions. I kept checking. Day after day. I cross-referenced numbers. Matched dates. Followed timelines. I wasn't searching for outrage. I was searching for consistency. Once consistency appears, the truth has nowhere left to hide. That's when I understood why the wedding had to be so extravagant. It wasn't about celebration. It was about cleaning money. Large events are useful that way. Flowers, venues, vendors, all legitimate expenses. A perfect shell to legitimize funds that shouldn't exist. Linda never asked what I was doing. One evening, she only said, "Don't let this change who you are." I nodded. I didn't tell her it already had. I promised her something else instead, that everything I was doing was to protect her, not to destroy anyone. When I had gathered enough, I thought about one man. Rachel had stayed close to him during the wedding. Mark called him his mentor. Others called him influential. I recognized the type immediately. I'd seen men like him before, people who believe rules are flexible when power is involved. I didn't call him. I sent a short email from an address he wouldn't recognize. No threats. No accusations. Just one sentence. "I think you'll want to see this before anyone else does." He replied faster than I expected. We met at a quiet CAF far from the city. He arrived early. I arrived on time. I brought only enough information to let him understand exactly who he was dealing with. I didn't speak much. I let him read. I watched where his eyes paused, where his hand stopped moving. Those moments told me everything. He finally asked what I wanted. I told him I didn't want money. I didn't want favors. I wanted the truth placed where it belonged, at the right time. If he valued his reputation, he would understand what cooperation meant. He stayed silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. That night, I came home late. Linda was waiting for me. She didn't ask where I'd been. She poured tea and placed the cup in front of me. I held her hand. For the first time since the wedding, I allowed myself to breathe. Because the matter had moved beyond family. It had become something that responsibility could no longer ignore. And once that happens, the ending is only a matter of timing. Things began to shift almost immediately after that meeting. Appointments were suddenly canceled. Trips were postponed without explanation. Emails that once received instant replies were now met with silence. Mark started calling me more often, his voice cautious, measured, like someone testing ice before stepping onto it. I listened. I responded like a concerned father who knew nothing. I gave away no details. That was the hardest part, acting unaware when the full picture was already clear. When you know the truth, restraint becomes a discipline. I continued gathering information, not because I needed more proof, but because patterns tell a stronger story than accusations ever could. Everything lined up too neatly to be coincidence. Rachel grew tense. Her messages to Linda became overly polite, overly warm. The kind of friendliness that appears when someone senses a shift but can't see where it's coming from. I waited. For people like them, collapse doesn't arrive with shouting. It arrives when they realize every door they believed was secure has already been locked. That moment came sooner than I expected. Late one evening, I felt it. Not intuition. Certainty. Mark and Rachel had returned to the estate after their final celebration before leaving for Paris. I drove there without calling ahead. No folder. No bag. Nothing that looked like preparation. I knocked. Mark opened the door and froze. Not surprise, fear. I saw it instantly. Rachel stood behind him, her smile stiff, like she was trying to remember what she'd missed. I need to finish something, I said. Mark stepped aside and offered me a seat. His hand shook slightly as he poured water. Rachel didn't sit. She leaned against the counter, her eyes drifting repeatedly toward the staircase. 10 minutes later, others arrived. Quietly. No flashing lights. No raised voices. Just people who knew exactly why they were there. Mark jumped to his feet. Rachel demanded to know what was happening. No one answered right away. I stayed seated, listening to my own breathing. I felt no triumph. No satisfaction. Only the sense that something long out of balance was finally being corrected. When they began speaking, I did too. I said I wasn't there for revenge or money. I was there to bring into the open what had been hidden behind smiles and congratulations. A screen turned on. The first image wasn't financial data. It was security footage from the wedding. The angle wasn't dramatic, but it was clear. It showed Rachel nudging the chair into the aisle. It showed Linda stumbling. And it showed Rachel's expression just before the wine was thrown. No one spoke. Rachel took a step back. Mark looked at me like I was a stranger. He didn't ask how I got the footage. He already knew. Then came the documents. Transfers. Dates. Signatures. Everything aligned. Mark collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Rachel began speaking quickly, disconnected sentences, trying to distance herself from what was undeniable. But facts don't argue. The man Rachel depended on wasn't there. His absence said enough. The moment he chose silence, her support vanished. I stood. I said this was no longer a family issue. It was a matter of responsibility. Linda would not be forced from her home. Not because ID saved it, but because no one ever had the right to take it. Mark finally called me Dad. His voice broke. He said he had no choice. I looked at him for a long time. There is always a choice, I said. Especially when the people you betray protected you when you had nothing. They led Mark away. Rachel sank to the floor. No one moved to help her. The room grew quiet. I left as dawn approached, without looking back. Because some doors close on their own. Morning arrived gently. There were no frantic calls, no knocks at the door, no urgency pressing in from the outside world. Sunlight slipped through the curtains and rested across Linda's face. She was sleeping more deeply than she had in weeks. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, just watching her breathe. Whatever the night had taken from us, it had given something back too. Peace. When Linda woke up, she asked one simple question. Is it over? I nodded. I didn't give details. I didn't list names or outcomes. I only told her this: no one would ever force her out of her own life again. She looked at me for a long moment, then reached for my hand. No tears. No more questions. Some truths don't need full explanations to be understood. We didn't return to the old estate after that. Not because of paperwork or ownership, but because too many memories were tied to trying to hold together a family that no longer existed the way we remembered it. We sold what we didn't need. Kept a few photographs, some clothes, and a folded map that had been sitting in a drawer for years. The RV wasn't new, but it was dependable. Strong enough for long roads and slow mornings. Linda liked sitting by the window, watching small towns pass by like quiet postcards. We drove without a schedule. We stopped when we were tired and moved on when we felt ready. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel responsible for fixing anyone but us. Some evenings, we parked near the ocean. Linda made tea. I sat outside listening to the waves roll in and out. No one mentioned Mark. No one mentioned Rachel. Not because we'd forgotten. Because we'd stopped letting them decide how we felt. One late afternoon, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I knew who it was before I answered. Mark's voice was careful, almost unsure. He apologized. No excuses. No blame. He said he'd finally had time to think real time, without anyone steering him. He asked if I could help him. I looked over at Linda. She couldn't hear the call, but she understood anyway. I told Mark I wouldn't interfere. Not out of anger. Out of respect for the lesson he needed to learn on his own. I said that if one day he truly understood what responsibility meant, we could talk again. But not yet. The call ended quietly. I didn't feel relief. Only balance. We kept moving: long highways, small diners, places where no one asks who you are, only what you'd like to drink. Linda grew stronger. She laughed more easily. Some mornings she woke before me, brewed coffee, and opened the door to let the breeze roll through. I thought a lot about family. I used to believe it survived through sacrifice and silence. I was wrong. Family can't exist when respect becomes optional. When boundaries disappear, peace doesn't follow. Damage does. One evening, Linda told me she no longer felt afraid. Not of being a burden. Not of moving slowly. Not of asking for what she needed. That was all I'd ever wanted for her. We stopped at a national park where the sky stretched wide and the quiet felt deep enough to hear your own thoughts. We stood together watching the sun dip below the horizon. I didn't feel like I'd won. I felt like I'd protected what mattered. This story doesn't end with applause or revenge. It ends with a long road ahead, one that doesn't need to prove anything. At my age, that's more than enough. Thank you for listening to the story of an old husband and father. I didn't share it to complain, but to preserve something fragile and important. Respect inside a family. When respect disappears, leaving isn't weakness. It's the last way to protect your dignity.